Okay, good. And here's Chris. Da 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 da. Hey, Chris, we're live. By the way, it's 12 noon. We're live and on Facebook.
Hello, and welcome to Tell a Damn Story on Facebook Live.
Okay, so we've got the logo up, which is nice. I just thought it was a cool way to start it out. Just let everybody see that before they are dazzled with our wonderful, and handsome and beautiful countenance. So here we go. I'm going to stop the share, and everybody's going to get to see Chris Ryan, Alex Simmons, and Dr. Vanessa Hintz. Hey, everybody, here we are.
Hello.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Yeah, it was a good morning for you. It's still afternoon for us.
Good day, everyone.
Just barely afternoon, though. Just barely afternoon.
Yeah, that's true. Well,
Doc, I got to tell you, this is a rarity. I never wear Hawaiian shirts on Tell the Damn Story, but since it's you, and since we're going to be talking horror, Alex Simmons, the teacher of all teachers, one time told me that what you talk about is attracted to you, right? So what you write about attracted to you. So just in case we attract any horrible creatures, I figure I'd dress like Alex Simmons. So we confuse the two of them, and the horror guy would go, and then you could get him on a couch and tell him, all right, so tell me when this began.
Right.
So that's the plan.
That's a great plan. Well thought out.
Well,
Yeah, truly well thought out. Yeah. Vanessa, can we call you Vanessa? Or do you want us to call you Doc? I mean,
you can call me Vanessa, please do.
This is Dr. Vanessa Hintz. Is that how we say the last name?
Yes.
Hintz, yeah.
That's cool.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Welcome to Tell the Damn Story.
Let's tell everybody a little bit about you.
Okay.
You are a licensed clinical psychologist, and you work with clients with a wide array of presenting issues. You're an active proponent of multicultural theory, and you work dynamically to understand how individuals make meaning of the world within their cultural context. You are also a self-proclaimed geek therapist, which is why you're here today. This is the land of that kind of fun. You incorporate elements of pop culture into treatment and training when beneficial, and we want to talk to you about that. You also work as an assistant professor at Alverno College, and you're the founder of Vivid Insights, which we'd like to hear about, that utilizes expertise in psychology and human behavior to provide consultation focused on the principles of equity, diversity, and inclusion. I have to say, Doc, the mix is fantastic.
Thank you.
I love the inclusion and the forward thinking and all that, and then a healthy dose of horror.
Yes.
I got to jump in and say that there's also comics in there, but we're going to focus on horror today. But she's also a comic book geek,
Yes.
So she's like full blown, intense,
Yes.
Whatever comes up, we're ready to handle. I'm just going to turn up our volume on my side a little bit so I can hear everybody well.
And while you're doing that, let me just quickly say to our listeners, by the way, yes, I know it's Tell the Damn Story, and we've done some great stories to tell here today. But once again, for those of you who are thinking, well, what's this got to do with writing and creativity? It's got everything to do with writing.
Oh, yes, it does. Yes,
it's how the characters impact us. It's how we impact our characters. It's what we bring to the table as creatives that influence and impact on our work and therefore impact on our audience. So horror, which I avoid like the plague, this lady dives into with both hands. So,
yes.
Yes. But our wall of non-paying sponsors would attest to the usefulness of horror. Yes, Doc, these are all our friends and all their productivity, and we would suggest that horror is a part of whatever you write, whether it's mystery. If there's a murder, that's horror. All the many things that Aaron Blackjack Day, which is what Alex, the the premier Alex Simmons creation. No, there are, the number is legion, Doc. You know that. He has to deal with horrors in everyday life, whether it be the racism of the 30s or war or terrorism. I mean, so I kind of break down that wall. However, I know that you can talk about classic horror as well. So let's see where we can go. Doc, can you tell us? I know you want us to call you Vanessa. I love saying Doc on the show. It's like, oh, tell the damn story as a doctor. Hey, now. Can you tell us a little bit about your roots? How did, what's your secret origin? How did you get to be a clinical psychologist / horror geek? That's a great combination.
Yeah, so I think the horror geek came first, obviously. The first scary movie I watched and fell in love with when I was entirely too young was Jason Goes to Hell. Jason is by far one of my most favorite characters of ever. I have him tattooed on me because that's
wow.
I love him. And I will tell you why. I will tell you why shortly.
Yeah, that's what I want to hear too.
I'm
Yeah.
sure
I would think I'm not paying the bill. Wait a minute. No.
But
who's the money?
Yeah, I fell in love with horror then. And as I was like going through school, all of that, whatever, I just, continue to watch scary movies, whatever. When I got to graduate school, when I was doing my graduate studies in clinical psychology, I took a class called Geek Culture and Psychotherapy. And so it was a class where we really shout out to Dr. Patrick O'Connor, who was really forward thinking and allowed me to start on this journey that I'm on now. But in that class, we really just leaned into our geekdom and how we can utilize that in the work that we do with our clients. And the rest is history, I think. And so now I think that, horror specifically deals with so many sort of existential elements. And I am an existential therapist, so it just fits for me. But I think outside of that, in the larger realm of popular culture, there's a reason that we, stand for things that we really, 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 really love in popular culture. And I think if we can utilize that for healing and for belongingness, why not?
So where were you when you met this particular professor? His name again?
Dr. Patrick O'Connor.
Dr. Patrick O'Connor. Where did you meet him?
Yeah, so I did my graduate studies at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology.
Very cool. So you're there and you were taking an array of courses, of course.
Yes.
But that one jumped out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because being nerdy, first of all, I think it's become much more in vogue of late because of Marvel and the MCU and all that. Now it's cool, whatever. I think before that, it was kind of like something that was separate, and even I think still to this day in the realm of academia, it's kind of like, okay, that's cute that you like those things and that, whatever. But I think that class and what I'm attempting to do now is to pave that way. And, like, this is cute and it is like, this is science, this is research, this is whatever you want to call it. And so I'm like determined to pave that way for popular culture, particularly in the field of psychology, but also just in the work that I do around equity and inclusion. There's so much richness in the stories that we see every day on the screen, in cinema, whatever, on, in books and comics. Like, why not? It's such a gift that we have all of these things to utilize. Why would we not? Why we got to be so stuffy?
Well, I think there's a generational shift going on. And I think that's you're part of that shift, and all hail that shift. I think the pandemic has helped push pop culture even further into the forefront of what we relate to and how we get our information and how we help decide who we are, what we are, and what we believe in. Would you agree, disagree, and could you speak on that for a while?
Agree wholeheartedly. I think that, when we were sort of, one blessing that I think came out of the pandemic was that it was a hard stop. Like, we are so go, go, go. We're in the culture of what I got to do, task oriented. Like, I got to go, 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 go. And the universe was like, no, we're going to stop for a little bit. And I think in that, obviously there were, I think, a spectrum, a range of things that happened, right? For some people, it was very difficult. Because when you have to stop doing, you have to start feeling. And when you start
Yeah.
feeling,
Mm.
sometimes that's not a fun experience. And where I think pop culture comes into that is pop culture helps us to feel for better or for ill. I
Oh, yeah.
think one thing, and I tell my students this all the time, one of my coping skills, I still watch The Young and the Restless. Like I've been watching The Young and
Yeah.
the Restless since forever because
Sure.
that's my escape. Like they do
Sure.
the same 5 storylines, like recycle them like every 3 years, whatever, but I love it. I love it. It's outrageous. And I love it because it gives me an opportunity to escape. Similarly, I think that's what horror does for me.
Yeah.
Sometimes it'd be too much, but I think there is, when we feel, sometimes it's easier to feel like a 1 degree removed. So I'm going to feel for
Yes.
that person that's not me, but you're still feeling feelings. So I think that that's great. You know what I'm saying?
And we consumed so much pop culture from the safety of our couch with a light on if we needed it.
All the time.
Right? Right?
I,
So
I
we,
want to just, I'm sorry, I just want to quickly,
ladies and gentlemen, here's Alex.
yeah, here's Alex. Da, 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 da. Okay. You said a couple of things. I mean, you said a number of things, but two things I just want to sort of focus on for just a moment. You talk about feelings, and then there's also there's horror, and then there's gore, and so first off, the feelings, especially when it contains to or pertains to rather creatives. Do you feel that in the horror stories, people are identifying with the creature, the villain, the murderer, whatever, or the victims, or the force that stands between the villain and the victims?
Mm-hmm. I think that's a great question. Like a therapist, I'm going to say it depends, because I think it depends on the person who is engaging with the horror. Because, for example, people who have been victimized may align with the victim. People who have felt that, who have felt a sense of not safety, like insecurity, all of that. People who have been villainized, as in marginalized folks in America, oftentimes identify with the villain. And I think a good example of this is not necessarily horror, but I think we could take it there. The Joker is one of the most beloved villains, super villains of ever. And I think it's because a lot of people who have been villainized by society can pick up what he's putting down, because he just doesn't care. He doesn't give a damn. And so, he's just out here like really leaning into that. And so I think that there's a part of us that yearns for that. Okay, if you're going to villainize me, I'm going to lean into that, and I'm going to, whatever. And so I think that it all depends on where we are in our space. And I think even for me, there are certain films that I've seen over and over and over again. And there are some times when I like, ooh, I feel connected to that character, to that person, depending on where I am in my life, what's going on in my world. And so I think that it absolutely depends. But I think every time we engage with a story, a film, whatever, we can have a different experience. Sometimes for good, sometimes for not, sometimes for whatever. You know what I'm saying?
Part of it is the familiarity of the story, but the other part is what you bring in at that moment. We recently being let's say the last 2 years, we had a combination of real life horrors, and I'd love to hear what you can comment on as far as how horror reflected on that. I mean, yes, the worldwide pandemic, truly scary. The enemy you couldn't see, right? But I would politely make an argument that the enemy we could see was scarier. The cop who was, killed George Floyd. And from there, an almost sadly endless list of other victims. It speaks strongly to the grace of African Americans that one of the major reactions was Black Lives Matter rather than tear everything down. I mean, if there was ever a reason to say, all right, enough, that viral video where, well, we know what the video was. Can you speak on dealing with those real life horrors,
Mhm.
and then what connections did you see with horror? You know,
Yeah. So
if
I will say that I've never seen the George Floyd video, nor will I ever watch that a day in my life, because that is a horror film. That is horror to me as a Black person. There are a number of these, public lynchings that we've seen over the past couple of years. I do not want to see that. I do not want to see that, and the fact that that was sort of broadcast so widely over, across the country and across the world, as a Black person, that was a horrific experience. And so I think that um to be Black in America, to be marginalized in America, is to live a horror movie every single day, to live a trauma and a tragedy every single day. I was fortunate enough to sit on a panel with the cast of the film American Skin. And that was actually a conversation we got into in that discussion. Is I would categorize that as a horror. That was a horror movie to me. It was so deep, so intense, so real. And to
yeah,
me, the horror that scares us the most is the one that is closest and the one that
yeah,
is the most real. Which again, Jason, that's not a real person.
right.
Existentially, yes. Physically in the world, no.
Oh,
And so I think I can consume that over and over and over again, because I know he's not going to show up at my door like, hey, what's up? But I think we think about other films like Get Out, um, and things like that. That is real to a lot of folks. And so I think, and more recently, Lovecraft Country, the series, which is amazing. If you haven't seen
yes,
it, shame on
yeah,
you. I think that
we're up there.
there's such a connection, like with it, that it is equally validating and terrifying at the same
Right.
time.
The difference I would respectfully offer between the George Floyd film and Lovecraft Country or Get Out or any of those is, if you were ignorant like me and were just innocently watching the news and not realizing, or your friend says that you have to see this, you didn't realize what you were hitting play for.
Mhm.
And unlike any of those films or shows, there is no break in the dynamic tension. I found myself, like so many others who were, foolishly subjected. You know what? I think I needed to see it, honestly, with all respect, because you have to see. If you don't understand, you have to see the naked brutality to get a glimpse. You know, um, and I kept waiting for this guy to get up. I had this, I come from a family of cops. I had this faith, and it never happened. And it just became more and more and more and more horrifying. And then, we watched the aftermath and all that stuff. Lovecraft Country eases you in, right? And you get a little kind of false sense of security. And then whoom, and by then it's too late. You don't know where the exit is. It's got its hooks in you. Even if you have to come back next week or wait for the next episode to start, you're in.
Exactly. Yes.
And that's the power and the glory.
So and again, where we are with this is, do you feel that, and we can go back to the horror films of the 40s and 50s, which were more monsters and things like that.
Get to those.
Right. Yeah. But we can go back there, but we can also look at, do you feel that horror films adjust to the societal frame of mind at any given decade, or do we adjust as we see these horrors? I mean, I'm just kind of curious which way you think it goes, because one thing is a vampire, which has now become a sexual thing, but one thing's vampires and Walking Dead monsters, and then suddenly it's slasher films and psycho killers, and then we're back to the undead again, and now we're at the zombie apocalypse 14. So I'm just curious, what is happening? Are we matching the horrors, or the horror matching us?
I'm such a therapist, and I'm going to say that's an impossible question to answer because I think it's symbiotic. I think that there's no way to, I'm such a scientist. I don't think we can prove causation in this sense. I think there is correlation, and I think that it is impossible for us to create a creative product that is not influenced by culture and vice versa. Like it's impossible to separate those things because we are inherently relational beings, and everything that I do is influenced by what I come into everything that I do because I don't exist in a bubble. Because I just can't. Existentially, I can't. I exist in a relational world. So I think that and I think a good example of that, and I'm not sure if I'm speaking ahead, but I'm gonna. They talked about this in the documentary. I think it was called Nightmares in Red, White, and Blue. But Freddy Krueger of the '80s was like the direct antithesis to like the whole return to morals type of argument situation. He just was like everything that was not. And I think there were more fans of him. I mean, I wasn't there, but there were more fans of him than maybe like, I think it was Reagan at the time or whoever that was. I don't even know. But I think that is an example of, okay, there's a piece of slasher films that is sort of like in alignment with that. Like, okay, if you do drugs, if you have sex, like you about to get dead. And there's these larger than life characters that are like, yeah, like total, like, and so I think it's just very interesting how those two things coincide, how they, influence one another.
So then how would you say that because you've hinted at this a couple of times, how do you see Jason then?
Whew. I was waiting for this.
Yeah, okay.
So Jason to me is like the ultimate tragic character. If you think about his just backstory, right? Like he was like differently abled from birth, bullied from birth, only had his mom. Where did his dad go? I don't know. He was never there. It was just him and his mom. That was his person. And he witnessed her being murdered. Savagely murdered. And Jason would leave everybody alone if they just left him alone. Like, I told you not to come around me. This is my space. Stop colonizing my space. Stop coming into my space. But people continue to do so and they continue to get dead. And so I think, but when we think about Jason, just again, that story, right? If Jason were a client, we would have all the empathy in the world for him because of the intense trauma he experienced. Again, from birth, differently abled, had physical deformities, cognitive, all of that, differently abled, only had his mom. She was his person, his go-to, his cheerleader, his everything. Okay, we're going to integrate you with society. We know kids are cruel, kids are mean. They were mean to him, killed him, he drowned, whatever. Then he really didn't. And then he sees his mom get her head cut off, spoiler alert. So it's kind of like, well, of course he's messed up, so to speak. He's having a trauma response, but also, again, people don't come into his space. He said, no, this is not for you. This is for me. But people just do what they want and colonize. And so here we have 11, 12 movies later, people still didn't get that picture. You should just leave him alone.
This is not reading the stay out sign is what you're saying here.
I don't, and every time you come back there, something terrible happens. Maybe you should stop. I don't know, but of course, colonizing.
That's such a great American tale, but America's not the only one that it applies to. But it's a pretty American tale, If I could ask 2 questions with Jason, and then we'll play with some other stuff. Do you mind playing?
Of course.
Okay, so knowing what you know and what you just gave us about what would be in his file, right? If they came to you, whoever they are, they think of the people that you work with and would accept a client from, right? And they say, Doc, this one's all you. He really needs your help. And into your office comes Jason, as you see him, mask, machete, onesie. Okay, how would you begin therapy?
First of first of all,
down the blade.
that's a Dickies jumpsuit that he's wearing. So
Oh, there you go.
First of all, we would
I
have
would
to
get my head cut off for calling it a onesie, so I'm gone.
exactly. We would have to be separated by
Sure,
glass.
by whatever
Like,
physical barrier, sure.
Yeah, we need. You can't be walking in here with the machete, and I'm just gonna
Yeah,
be okay with it. Like, no.
I don't
Maybe-
know if you have complete control. You're in one
So-
side of the unbreakable glass. He's the other. You can describe what he would be, how he would
Mhm.
appear, whatever you want. But I'd love to hear how you would approach this situation, this patient.
And I think the first thing we have to recognize, which I think oftentimes maybe we don't, where he is cognitively, right? He's not going to be a person that we could sit and have a whole talk therapy session with. He just is not there mentally. We see that over and over. He's very carnal, like, and so first and foremost, we need to establish, how are we even going to do this right now? How are we even going to have these conversations? He shows in various movies like some level of understanding. So I think the first thing is to assess that. I think the other thing that can't be negated again is the trauma that he's experienced. That doesn't, excuse all the things that he's done. It also gives it a different context. Whereas, again, just to sort of juxtapose him with like Freddy Krueger, for example, he also experienced a trauma, but that was because he was a child molester. And
Yes.
so it's a very, very, very different context. And so I think that when working, and again, it's another reason that I love the character of Jason, because his context is so complex and it's so human, because we as humans are beautifully and confusingly complex. And so, okay, you look at him, and a lot of people who, talk bad about slasher movies, it's like, oh, he's just murdering people and he's so big, whatever. And there's this whole complex, intricate web of sort of intrapsychic things that are going on, in addition to, again, his sort of external environment. And so, to return to your question again, I think we just have to establish, where are we cognitively? What kind of conversation can we even have? And what is your level of understanding? 2, we really need to process this trauma that you've experienced. And 3, if we were able to do so, to have a conversation that was coherent, what do you want? What would you prefer? What are, not even goals, I don't like that word, but like, what is your motivation in terms of, do you want to just have your space over here? Which is, again, I think what he's been telling us, I want my space, leave me alone and I'll be fine. If that's what you want, okay, cool. How can we make that happen in the context of the larger world? So I know that's what you want. Do you want us to put you on a little island and you can just stay there by yourself? Like, do you want to reintegrate into society? What do you want? And then how can we get you there?
That for you. Fantastic. Now, the follow-up question I have, I'm going to kind of switch gears slightly. Many of the people in our audience are emerging writers, right? And we may have some horror writers here today or in subsequent viewings. The thing with something like a Jason movie is it's always more successful when the writer and developers and the director of those movies remember these core things that you're talking about. So here we have an emerging writer who says, I think I got a new monster for the 2020s. I think what would you urge that emerging writer to remember and to build into such a character? What is the difference between just another slasher or just an empty shell and something that truly touches us?
And I think it is, and I have this conversation with my mom all the time. I think I dislike characters that are very obviously good or bad. Like, I love like I said, complexity. I love the ambiguity of it, in terms of, you look at that character and you sort of think about those core tenets, and it's like, ooh, it can go either way. I think Thanos is a good example of this. I think Eric Killmonger is a good example of this. Depending on this is how I read them, like in my interpretations. But I think that, like, Jason is a killer with a backstory. And I think Freddy Krueger is also a killer with a backstory that's just gross. But I think that is what makes them more human. And one of the first geek therapy presentations I ever gave was about the existential nature of Freddie and Jason and how we love them because they touch us as human beings. There's something about, even though they're like these supernatural creatures, right, that never die and whatever, they have power, whatever, there's something about them that is inherently human. And I think, to me, characters and sagas and stories, whatever, that are long lasting are so because they touch us in an existential way. There are things that we watch that are just like, okay, this is cool to see, this is cool to read. But I think the things that to me are just so beautiful are those things that are just as complex and intricate and messy as we are as human beings. So again, if I'm watching something and it's kind of like, okay, like that is obviously the good person, this is obviously the bad person, and there's no in between, there's no gray area, for lack of a better term, I'm like, okay, I want to be, and maybe that's just me because I'm just I like to think and really have to grapple even morally with like, ooh, like how do I cognitively reconcile the fact that Jason just murders at will with the fact that he has this trauma? How do you reconcile that? And I think every person does that differently.
Well, I have more trouble reconciling with the popularity of Freddie than I do of Jason. And primarily because it seems after the first film, Freddy Krueger, Nightmare on Elm Street, the first film, it's like a whole population, a whole generation forgot. No, he was a child molester. Why are we rooting for him?
Yes.
And in both forms,
he violated, and he murdered children. I got no sympathy for this dude.
Zero.
And then to see kids dressing up as him in Halloween really freaked me out. So it was like, stomp this boy down. Is where I'm coming from with that.
But to go with Doctor's theme, Freddy is a predator in life, and then he's a predator in supernatural life. Jason was a victim in life, and if you don't go to that particular camp, you never meet him.
Yep.
I mean, he eventually did go to New York and hell and space and all that.
Yeah,
but
right.
that was at that point, those were just cash-in movies. I don't think they have the same core as the originals. Speaking of core, and since we're talking about that, if you don't mind, Alex and I would like to escort you onto Alex Simmons' time machine. We'd like to take you back, not that far, because Alex can go back to the 1800s, but we'd like to take you back to, like, say, the 30s and 40s and work our way through some foundational creatures or characters or monsters, and see your take on them. You were talking about, the backstory, the soul, the empathy that you could generate for Jason. And I think one of the things that helped create the horror genre, even though Dracula was the first of the universe, it was Karloff's Frankenstein and the empathy that he was able to generate that gave that genre a chance. What do you think about, I mean, I don't know how versed you are in the Universal monsters, but let's go through, Frankenstein, Dracula, and Wolfman, maybe the Invisible Man, but just see what you think as far as what they offer from a psychological basis, what they offer culture. Yeah. What do you think about Frankie?
I think Frankenstein, especially, he is a monster not of his own creation. And so I think, again, returning to this idea that for, marginalized folks or people who are othered traditionally in culture, we too are monsters not of our own making. So if someone is, has some sort of prejudicial or stereotypical belief about me, that's not because of me, that's because of you. So now I'm a monster in your eyes, but not because of my own making. And thinking about grappling with that every single day, right? Like walking into a space and knowing that you are, immediately othered, not because of anything you did, but just because of the way you look and who you were born as. And so when you think about Frankenstein, same thing. Like he he didn't ask to be this way, yet he is. And now it's like, oh God, kill the monster, whatever, like, whoa, I just whatever. So I think with Frankenstein, again, and I think that this is something that we see over time, and sort of like the way that we connect with characters. Again, there's something felt that I can align with that character, which is why I'm drawn to it.
Yes.
You know what I'm saying?
And particularly the Karloff rendition showed that otherness, showed that empathy, that sadness, that I'm just trying to be,
Trying to figure it all out. Well, how about the werewolf now? How about, and
There you
again,
go.
looking
With the wolf man.
Yeah, the wolf man, or
When the moon
witch,
comes
the
out,
werewolf,
I
right.
turn into a wolf.
Thank you. Yeah. What's your take on that? If you've seen any of the universal version of the Wolfman, as opposed to Werewolf in London.
So I have seen that.
Ah.
I also got my fill of werewolves in True Blood.
Oh.
And I can't believe I'm gonna say this out loud, in Twilight. Which doesn't count, but okay, I was there, whatever.
Yeah, you were there.
I was in it.
That's all right.
I think there's something about I think there's something that we find attractive about that sort of like alpha energy. That's sort of like, I have a beast within me that if you push me too far, it's gonna come out and I'm just gonna like wreck stuff. You know what I'm saying? And so I think there is something appealing about that, sort of being in touch with that carnal nature, and sort of like, whoa, it's not me, it's the moon. Like the moon brought this out of me, not me.
Control,
and now that the moon brought it out, people are about to get messed up. And I do think that there's something, again, just evolutionarily, that we connect with regard to just being like a mindless beast that has to, go forth and do whatever to satisfy that,
that urge, whatever
that
it
need is.
Yeah. But I mean, I would also point out that, again, the takes on werewolves shifts again with where society is at any given decade, because I can think of the Lon Chaney Jr. portrayals in the Universal films, and this is a man cursed. So he didn't choose this. He wasn't born into this. He was inflicted with this. And now there's no hope. And he's out of control at certain points in his life, and he's looking for help, and he's looking for some sort of salvation. And that's different from the I'm a stud muffin and yeah, I can tear you to pieces too. It's a different take. Or even with the underworld portrayals, where it's a whole family, it's a lore, it's generational, and there's a proud, legion of us in another portion of this world that we exist in. So I'm just, again, I guess what you're saying is that as creatives, and not to ignore the audience, but as the creatives, as writers and actors and producers trying to put out this kind of material, looking at these characters on more than one level is key.
Yes.
And then finding ways to connect with your audience in either an empathetic way, some sort of sympathetic way or manner, or if it is feeding our desire to feel power at some point. Maybe we're feeling powerless in our normal lives, but if we could hang with this dude, yeah, this person's got the power. I'm there. So, but either way, connecting with your audience on some emotional level with your character. Okay.
So the werewolf type character is one of loss of control, and the vampire is always one of seduction. What is your take on vampires?
I'm sorry, I'm laughing because, again,
have fun, please.
Of True Blood and what that series, like how sexualized it was.
Yes.
I'm just thinking back and how they just ruined it at the end. But I think that to me, vampires are interesting because now we have that element of immortality. And I think that that's another thing that I talked about before with regard to Jason and Freddy. I think that that's something that some people yearn for, even though we see that, like, in certain depictions of vampires that have lived centuries and centuries and centuries, like, they're isolated because everybody you get close to dies or whatever, or you just have like this one person, whatever. So I think that what's interesting about vampires, I do think that seductive piece of, just being able to control people lustily. Also being this just sort of like apex predator. So like you are there's a mastermindedness behind it. Whereas like you mentioned with werewolves, it's just like, oh, well, when the moon comes, I don't know what's happening.
I
I'm
lost
not
control.
myself.
Yeah,
But vampires
yeah.
are so tactful. And then
Yeah.
I think again that sort of existential piece of like your clock's not gonna run. I mean, depending on which variation we're watching, but
Yeah, really.
typically if you just mind your
Right.
business, you'll be around forever and ever.
Depends on how you do it. There's a great take on that with The Hunger, which was a movie in the 80s with David Bowie, and he aged out, and they just put him with all the other vampires who aged out. They locked him in a casket kind of thing in the attic, and Susan Sarandon and Genevieve, I forget who the other actors were. They just
Genevieve
continued.
Bujold?
I think so. I forget.
Yeah.
They just kept hitting the clubs. You know. So, well, okay. I want to go to the 50s when, science loses its mind and everything gets really big. But before that, I can't resist asking you, 2021, these three classic style monsters, the Frankenstein, the werewolf, the vampire, which is the most difficult to treat as a patient?
That's a good question, because I'm thinking of all of them and the difficulties that I think there would be. I think with vampires, I think that would be my weakness, because I too am a person. So like, if you're going to seduce me, it's not like I have special mind powers that I'm not going to fall under that seduction. Like, all right, then I guess that's just what we're going to be doing. So I think that would be
just open the blinds a lot.
I'm gonna
have the sunny part of the room.
Exactly.
That would definitely be a challenge. All right, let's go to the 50s, back into interpretation of what it means for the culture. A lot of big giant insects or flying saucers or the blob. It was science out of control. A lot of atomic things, So what was the creativity reacting to in society at that point? What's your interpretation of
I think it's
big giant grasshoppers and stuff?
I think it's what we see now with regard to a lot of the fear around artificial intelligence, but it's, science, don't get too big for your britches now, because if you do, I think that's similar, like some of these contagion type movies or like zombie apocalypse. It's traced back to somebody doing something in a lab they weren't supposed to be doing, and whoop, now like The Stand almost, now
Right.
like this whole thing that's happening. And so I feel like it was, and if I'm not mistaken, that was around the time there was fear of like nuclear war and like
sure.
Oh yeah. Well, we'd had Hiroshima,
nuclear war, the Red Thread, everything that was big and out of control. Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
And so I think it was almost feeding into that fear, like, see, this could happen because of science, and I think that science in that sense was to be feared, but also could be controlled, because like, how do we resolve these things? Like, we out science the science. So we have this thing, so now we got to out science it and do something else. So I think it was a direct sort of like correlation to that.
Well, just quickly, oh God, War of the Worlds, and again, the version there's the radio version of that, the radio theater version of it with Orson Welles in the 40s. But then there's also, I think it was the late 50s, early 60s, there's a film version of it. And in either case, we're invaded by aliens from another world, and our science can't take them out. They're devastating. They're wiping us out. It's like we have no chance. And then suddenly their ships start falling from the skies and they start collapsing. And it turns out it's biological. It's some little bacteria on our Earth that we've developed an immunity to, and they can't, and they're just dropping dead. So the world is saved. And it's funny because the War of the Worlds version of the radio theater alluded to this without saying it. And then the movie said it a little bit, but it was some sort of divine intervention. It was, that God in his wisdom had created this earth with such and such, and we should be thankful for blah, 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 blah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So you know,
How are
again,
we gonna end this? I don't know.
yeah. He sneezed and he dropped dead. Okay,
There
but
you go.
you know, again, when we think about the vampire scenario, at least the way it was presented until Anne Rice gave us an interview with a vampire, there was a whole thing again of religion versus evil, and to be protected, run into a church, wear a crucifix or a Star of David if you're of that particular persuasion. Um, do you feel like because, and again, I know this may be taking it in a different direction than you thought, but monsters, good guys, bad guys, creatures, empathy. Do you feel that religion or some sort of some sort of ethical code in our society is shifting, and subsequently we have to deal with our monsters differently?
Mm. And yeah, it's interesting because I think this is what we see a lot of in the 70s with a lot of the supernatural, The Omen, Rosemary's Baby, I think,
Exorcist.
which is by far the scariest film I've ever seen in my life.
The
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 Exorcist.
Exorcist. Yeah.
I just cannot. And
Yeah.
I think we see a lot of that sort of good versus evil supernatural element. Also, demonic children, like,
Hmm.
which I think is just an interesting juxtaposition because children are innocent, but then you have these children that are doing these like, oh God, what is happening? So I do think that that sort of morality enters into the conversation, particularly when we're talking about the supernatural realm, because again, if we are fighting against those dark forces, we have to bring the forces of light. And so often those forces of light are connected to religion, which I think is interesting now in the world we live in, which I don't think this is new, but I do think that with younger folks, I'm seeing, particularly with my clients, this sort of split from organized religion to more spirituality and sort of those types of more Eastern types of practices. And so it will just be interesting to see how that manifests, because I think there's a trope in horror of like, Catholicism and exorcism and all of that. Will that evolve as we move forward to be less around organized codified religion and more so towards, which also has a spirituality also has an element of morality. It's just not codified in that way, and it's more individual.
I think, Doctor, that you've just launched 23 scripts from people who are listening and said,
Do it.
Get rid of that old priest and the young priest. We're going with a Buddhist.
Hey, you know why? And a rabbi,
why not? Yeah, why not? Just go on.
Because that's what it comes down to for me. Is it comes down to what do you believe? What do you believe in? What are you trying to say? What characters are interesting and fascinating to you as a creative? And yes, if there's only theoretically 7 plots in the universe, what do you bring to the table? What's your lens that's going to allow us to look at this story in a different light? Like I look at like, again, Night of the Living Dead. I was alive when that film was made. I saw it on television when it first broadcast on TV in the 60s or something, or late 70s. No, late 60s, early 70s. So I mean, George Romero, that's right. Another the time machine thing. But so I'm really zombied out. I mean, Walking Dead was like, no, please, but it keeps going on. But when I saw, I just didn't want to see any more zombies. And then I saw Shaun of the Dead and I cracked up because it was a different spin on the same old. And more so than Z Nation, although at least in Z Nation, they weren't lumbering like the Mummy, they were running. It was like a horde of ants, so I said, okay, different spin. And then what I think was Warm Heart, where, okay, maybe there's a cure, but it's something that happens if you fall in love. How does that work? Biology, heat, but okay, I'll roll with that. I'll experiment with that thought. But it's like, what do you bring to the table that's different? That tilts this thing in a slightly different direction, so that you can attract a whole new audience, or maybe the same audience.
Zombie love app.
There you go. That's right. Start dating zombies. Yes, So quiet,
quiet kind. Walk slowly, but
eats brains.
For love.
Eats brains. Yes.
I wanted to play with that because Romero's last bit is on Netflix now, so the longevity of that is amazing. But you brought up what was the Walking Dead, and I wanted to see if we could zero in on a moment when the Walking Dead, both in the comic book reading and this is where all your cards and letters are welcome. And in the show itself, when they mercilessly killed, very graphically, two very popular characters, their audience began to sink. There seemed to be a bridge too far, both when it happened in the comics and then when it happened, and they try to tease you and kill one guy, and then they went and killed exactly the same guy, exactly the same way as they did in the comics, and their enormous audience just turned to like ridiculously big audience. Why do you think? What would your interpretation of that be? I know it's unfair to say, why do you think?
Yeah.
What does that say about an audience saying, okay, that's the line? What does that say about us?
It's interesting because I was one of those people who left. I left The Walking Dead after, spoiler alert, I think it was after Carl. After
Okay.
So I haven't watched it since
Yeah,
then.
you lasted longer than I did.
I just couldn't, and I'm like, what are we doing? And then they said Rick was going, and I was like, well, I'm done with this.
Right.
So I do think that there is a point where it's like, okay, I'm feeling that's too much. And I
Right.
think what we see sort of therapeutically, it's like there's a difference between sadness and depression. So there's a difference
Yeah.
between experiencing a feeling and then it becoming a state of being that is overwhelming. And I think sometimes that's what we see in like in The Walking Dead, for example. It's like, okay, this is like dark and there's like a lot of feelings. You remember the end of season 1, it's like, oh my gosh, this is so much. And then they just go, and it's like, okay, you know what? I can't take any more, and I'm just going to protect myself. I'm gonna do this now. And I don't know how they have done since then, but
one of the things that
like they took a hint. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
One of the comments I had about it, and I'd love to see your feedback on it, is that in any story endeavor, any writing, any creation like that, you're entering into a contract between the creator and the recipient. And the writer, the creator, has to uphold her or his or their end of that creativity. You're entering into a relationship where the reader or viewer says, okay, I'm going to watch your story and I expect certain things. Now, I'm not saying you have to patronize, but there has to be at least some give and take. And I think that's what happened with that, is that the experiment, and God bless them for experimenting, was what if we don't? You know, and now we know. I want to go to a different direction that hits on something that I know is close to your heart, but we haven't gotten a chance to. It's a slight step away from the traditional monsters. I promise we'll end up with those again. But you are also a comic book geek as well, as I hear. And there's, especially in the last few Avengers movies, in the MCU, they categorize themselves as monsters. You know, both the heroes and I think in Avengers of Ultron, Age of Ultron, there at one point each of the major characters calls themselves a monster. You could see that, yeah, sure, but its intent and what you do with it. Is Marvel a universe full of monsters that just chooses how they express themselves?
It's interesting because I think it goes back to what we were talking about with regard to Frankenstein, right? Like they are people with these abilities. I mean, Tony Stark, that's a different thing. Like he just whatever. But they are people with this tremendous amount of responsibility that did they give themselves? Arguably, maybe yes, maybe no. There are people with a specific set of skills that have the ability to intervene when something like Ultron happens, when something like Thanos happens. And I think maybe feel as if, do they have the power to say like, no, I'm not going to do that? Like, yeah, I know I can help, but y'all got this. Like, it's cool. I'm going to just go sit over here. And I think that sort of, it almost has that element to me of, I didn't ask for this. And now I feel, I'm just this this entity that was created, but not necessarily of my own making. And now I'm sort of like, this weight is on me. So like Frankenstein, the weight is now on him. So like, how do I move through the world as this big lumbering person who just hurts people when I touch them type of situation? So I think with the Avengers also, and I think we saw that in, I think it was starting in Age of Ultron, but more so in Civil War, where it's like, okay, we need to either somebody needs to check us or we need to just, you know, like, so I think there's this element of like, how do I be in the world with this content? You know what I'm saying? So I think that arguably, if we're using that frame, they are monstrous, but is that necessarily a negative thing?
And Alex knows my favorite Marvel character. And I would be able to make the argument that this is one exception of person who was not monstrous until the snap and then became monstrous for a while. And that's Hawkeye. Hawkeye is self-made and then loses everything. And still doing a righteous thing, but he's a mass murderer, you know, when we see him as Ronin and that kind of stuff. I wonder how history will view the Marvel Cinematic Universe, because they really are taking fascinating chances with storytelling. I mean, if you look at Tony Stark, arguably the hero of that first major arc, most of the trouble is his fault. He created most, where it goes from here, I don't know. We'll take this moment to make a quick left to Alex Simmons.
Yeah, again, we can definitely talk Avengers and stuff another time. I want to go back to the monster thing again, and
I want to go forward to the monster things. I want to hear what her favorite monsters are. But
well, and that's a good one too. But I'd asked you earlier, and I don't think I got a chance to follow through on it. Horror versus gore. And where do you see that? I don't want to lead you, so I'm just gonna say, where do you see that? How do you see that?
Yeah. Okay. So I think that in the early or in the 2000s, and since then we moved into this trope of like, torture porn, Saw, Hostel, movies like that. That ain't my jam. I don't know. It's just not like it. I think when I was younger, I was like, oh yeah, great. But as like, no, I just can't. But I think that one thing that is interesting to me is there is something, and I don't know if we're gonna touch on this, but like what we saw in the 60s, right, with Hitchcock and like psychological horror and all of that, there is something very different about gore and physically scary types of monsters versus like the person next door who might just be sitting, like Norman Bates might just be sitting next to you on a bus, and you have no idea that or like I think American Psycho did an amazing job of sort of like that with Patrick Bateman. And so I think that gore for me is like, okay, yeah, yep, that's a lot. Like that's a lot. And to me, what is I don't know. It's not my cup of tea, because I think I appreciate more of the, again, complexity and intricacy of like horror that you can't readily see. So I think that supernatural movies, like I'm like rewatching the whole Conjuring universe. And I think there's something about that to where it's kind of like, ooh, this is like physical, but not really. And there's like and I think gore to me is just very in your face. I think it has a place. The place is just not on my TV. You know what I'm saying? It's very difficult for me.
Well, I find it kind of interesting because in a juxtaposition, there's the gore of a Freddy Krueger film or even a Jason film, or certain elements that are gory, not the whole film, and it's disturbing, and then there's a disturbing, like a certain scene in Saving Private Ryan. And if anybody has seen the film, I don't know if you have, Chris, or not, but there's a scene when they're taking the village where they've come to save Private Ryan in particular, and one of the soldiers gets into a hand-to-hand fight with a German soldier. Sure. And it's a very slight American soldier fighting this sort of bruiser of a German soldier, and the battle comes down to a bayonet, which is being brandished like a knife. and the German soldier gets on top of the American soldier, and he has the blade on his chest, and then begins to, spoiler alert, slowly shove it into his chest. And the whole time he's doing it, the guy is pleading for his life until it, it starts to intercut, and then he can't say anything.
And the
And
Nazis.
and yeah, right. And the German soldier is going shh, 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 like as in,
You can call him a Nazi.
very, very intimate. And that disturbed me for days. That disturbed me more than the opening scene of that movie when they were being cut down while trying to take the beach. So, to me, there's a sort of a sadistic aspect of certain gore scenes that, and it's me, I don't need. I don't, I'm not comfortable with a lot of property or product that's produced with a sadistic slant for the sake of sensationalism, and that bothers me.
Right.
And again, I don't know if that's where some of these films are going. I think some of it is just lack of creativity. It's like, oh,
Well-
let's just do this for the sensationalistic moment because we don't know what else to do. But I think other times it feels like this is particularly set up to elicit this kind of feeling in this moment.
Well, I would point out that there is an audience for slasher and an audience for gore. What they get out of it is what they get out of it. I don't know, but there's an audience for everything.
And I think what I just add to that is, I do think that the scene you just described from Saving Private Ryan, I don't like war movies, so no thank you. But I think what to me sort of stuck with me about that is I think that sometimes too, which is another reason why I think the Norman Bates, the Patrick Batemans, the like the slashers of the human slashers of the world, it's hard to fathom that humanity can go that way. Like someone can do that to another person. I think like with the Saw franchise, and we have the, I stopped after number 2, but we have the, the whole backstory of Jigsaw and like why he's doing that. And so I think that, in some instances there is creativity to give a lens to, okay, why are you doing this? Because again, I think we don't want to envision that darker side of humanity. And so I think for some people who don't particularly like gore, it's like, I don't want to think about that. And I think for maybe some folks who lean into it, it's because, yeah, people can be messed up like this. And it, like, let's not ignore that that's a thing that happens, because oftentimes a lot of this gore, I mean, it's based in reality. These things happen and we don't want to think about it, and they still happen. You know what I'm saying? So
I would say that for me, it's probably the difference between a meal every now and then of this and a series of franchise fast food restaurants. And I feel like that's what's happening, that for a certain period of time it was like fast food. It was just we're just churning these suckers out because they sell, and I do believe that media affects people. And it's not just we affect media. No, media affects people, and there's a certain sort of concern I have for that. But that's me. That's me. I need to point out that we've been going for almost an hour, and so we're sort of coming down to the hour. But I know
the
Chris,
words right out of my mouth.
Chris has got. Go for it, Chris.
I think we have a final question for you, and if it's okay with you, I'd like to kind of put together 2 of the things you use in treatment. Okay. One, you do consultation that's focused on the principles of equity, diversity, and inclusion. How do you see those areas possibly being represented in your other love, horror? How do you see those things happening? Because, for years or decades, the black guy would be the first one killed and the cheerleader would be the second one killed. But, films are starting to, Get Out and a few others are starting to change that. How do we see it? And what does equity horror or diversity horror or inclusion horror mean? What would that look like for you?
I'm laughing because you took the words right out of my mouth. Like even growing up and still now I'm like, oh, that black dude gonna die. He gonna be the first one to
5
die.
minutes. He's got 5 minutes.
He's gonna die like the most gruesome. I remember in the Friday the 13th remake, the black guy died, like Jason threw an axe and he was like laying out there dying slowly. And I was like, why they do that to the black dude? But I think, to me, what it looks like, a couple of things. One, I think it looks like representation. Representation matters. So to see not just like a group of white, beautiful 20-somethings that are pretending to be teenagers, like, no, I think we have to see all folks represented in all films, but particularly in horror, and not just as like the funny gay sidekick or like whatever. Like, I think we have to expand our ideas. Like, the final girl is always a skinny white girl. Like, why does that have to be a thing? Can we not? Like, can we just, it's 2021. Can we go above and beyond? And so I think, one, it looks like representation. I think, two, it looks like films like Get Out and shows like Lovecraft Country, that this is the horror that people of color experience every single day. And I think we could insert any other marginalized group into that. We could make a horror film about what it means to be a trans person in America. And so I think that, again, horror is not just things that go bump in the night. It's me living my life every single day in the skin, in my truth. And so I think representation and DEI in horror looks like that. Like, the Jordan Peels of the world, the Misha Greens of the world, like, let's bring that to the forefront and stop acting like that's not a thing that people experience every day. Because, again, that is horrific. And you think about living that same thing every single day, that is trauma. And I think those two things put together are typically what elements that we find in most horror films.
What would you say to the filmmaker or the author who wants to make the monster ethnic or trans? I don't think that I'm not sure, maybe it does address the need, but yeah.
Yeah.
What do you think?
It's interesting because I sat on a panel at a con with a comic book author who shall remain nameless. But I sat on a panel having the discussion about whose responsibility is it, like, creatively, to ensure that your representations are accurate. And we got in the conversation around, like, you know, but if I portray a character, like, that is art. I'm not trying to make it an accurate portrayal. It's just an art. Like, so if I want to portray a trans person or, you know, a black person or whoever in this way, I'm not doing it because that's reflective of society. I'm doing that because that's my art. And I think for me as a clinician and talking to people who engage with this material, if I as a marginalized person only see my likeness portrayed in a negative way, how do you think I'm going to internalize that? And so I think that, and again, Alex and I have had a conversation about this. I don't necessarily think of myself as a creative. So I think that my opinions about this may be whatever, biased in some way, but I do think that there is a semblance of responsibility about how you represent particularly marginalized people, because people who are marginalized are often depicted in this sort of like negative type of way. And I think there is a creative responsibility of how am I contributing to that? And if I am contributing to that, am I like claiming that, like, yep, I know that this is not, you know, people are not monoliths and this is not representative of all folks. But I think so often there's this like veil of, well, this is creativity, so I can do whatever I want. And then there's like an absolving of responsibility of how that impacts.
Yeah, I think you have to be responsible. We will go back to Alex's mention before of George Romero's Night of the Living Dead. The hero of that is an African-American guy, until the real heroes come in and commit murder. And really a strong statement way back, you know, when Alex was only like 70. You're just, you know, but, you know, that I think that's a pretty good example of
You are so in trouble.
Being responsible, you know,
You are so gonna get it.
Storytelling. I'm sorry, Doc, I am contractually obligated to
mess with me, right?
just a little bit. but it is what it is. What would you like to see? Final question. This is like the third final question, Doc. But you've been so interesting, and thank you for your time again. What would you like to see? Everything's opening up again, and your favorite format, whether it's film or TV or comic or novel, what monster would you like to see? What interpretation would you like to see?
Mhm. So I am a fan of like the Conjuring type of supernatural demons type of situation. So I like that. And as again, anybody take this, but just make sure you at me. I would like to see an interpretation of that is not so rooted in like Catholicism and the church, because I do think we have seen in the past, like I'm thinking of like Serpent in the Rainbow, where we see more like other forms of spirituality and religion used to sort of like ward off the evil. I would like to see more of that. I would also like to see recently, I think it was 2 years ago, Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark came out. That movie, whatever, was maybe like a 6, but I think they made that movie off of a series of books that I loved, like from the mid 90s. And so I would like to see more of that. Like millennials, like we're getting like a little bit, bring some of that stuff back, like bring that just warmed my nostalgic heart. And so, but I would like to see more of the good versus evil that's not rooted in like organized religion, because again, there's so much more than that.
Yeah, maybe the what was it? I've lost the word. I'm sorry.
I don't know.
The social the social contract. We seem to have forgotten that. There's basics, yes and no. We don't need to have a priest involved in that, or a governor. We just what's the right thing to do. I don't know. I hope America's ready. I hope the world's ready for that. But we'll see.
We'll find out. Again, Vanessa, thank you so much for spending this time with us, and I hope we didn't drive you too crazy.
No, this was a blast, and happy Father's Day to everyone.
Thank you very much.
Dad, Parker Hicks, my father-in-law, Joe Crest. Happy Father's Day.
Yes, and happy Father's Day to all you dads out there. Crack open that barbecue or whatever the heck it is you're going to do and enjoy your day. I'm certainly going to enjoy mine. And Chris, I hope you're going to enjoy yours.
Oh, yeah. I'm having a great time. It's beautiful weather out, and we're inside doing a Facebook Live. It's exactly how I like to do it.
Well, you got the shirt for it.
A book, one of these.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
again,
either way.
Doctor, thank you very much. I love your vision. About what's that big head little doll there? What are those called?
Bobbleheads or whatever it was.
The pop-ups. The
pops.
Yep, and you got vision right there. So yes, I was looking for a Hawkeye, but you can't get everything.
Okay, you take care, everybody. Take care. Thanks again.
Peace.
Bye-bye.